Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 13, which will be a short lecture and which will wrap up our study of the Renaissance period. As always, I know you're dying with excitement. I have the terms and the people that we'll be talking about in today's lecture. So today is all about the rise of instrumental music. And one of the really cool things that happened in this period is that as the Renaissance period progressed, we see that more and more instrumental music was actually written down and preserved. That tells us a couple of things: that people believed that music without voices was really worthy of preserving, and it also indicates that the instrumentalists themselves were becoming more literate. Previous to this, instrumentalists typically learned by ear and then improvised. But now, as the middle class was increasing, as education was increasing, we begin to see musicians across the board learning how to read music and also how to compose music. So that was a really big deal. And really, for the first time, instrumental music became as interesting and as challenging as vocal music. Instrumentalists were also not above co-opting vocal pieces for their own enjoyment, and I admit I've been guilty of arranging a few of my favorite madrigals for oboe choirs, so I can totally get where they're coming from. We have different books, again, with the rise of middle class and then more discretionary income and the commercial possibilities. So people began to publish books that talked about the different instruments and offered some kind of basic instruction. And one of the most important resources we have was by a musician named Michael Praetorius. So Praetorius did a whole collection of these beautifully engraved woodcuts that were then published. It was published under the title Syntagma Musicum, which just means a systematic treatment of music. And it really gives us great visual images of the instruments that were popular and being utilized in the Renaissance period. Praetorius and other composers of instrumental music also began to incorporate different designations. So, for example, higher instruments like a recorder or a sham would be designated as a haut instrument, H-A-U-T in French. The lower instruments would be designated as a bass instrument. And increasingly, instruments appeared in consorts. So a consort is just a family of the same instrument, but of all different sizes. So if you can picture a group of recorders, from some that are only 6 inches long all the way down to some that are several feet long. And again, the smallest ones are the highest, the bigger ones were the lowest, but they were all recorders. That's a great example of a consort or a family of instruments. Well, we already spent quite a bit of time in the Middle Ages talking about a lot of the instruments that were being utilized in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and you can certainly refer back to those as needed. I did want to talk about just a few of the keyboard instruments today that really changed quite a bit in the Renaissance period from what came before. So organs continue to be one of the most important keyboard instruments of the period, utilized in the church. But again, as cathedrals were getting larger and larger and churches were getting larger and people had more money, we begin to see the installation of these giant organs in these cathedrals filled with these beautiful pipes and detail. And of course, the growth in organ repertoire increased exponentially as the Renaissance period progressed and also into the Baroque period. A more intimate kind of keyboard instrument which became popular in the Renaissance was called a clavichord. And a clavichord was like a little personal keyboard. They weren't designed to be performed in concert halls or for bigger audiences. Their dynamic is very soft, and so it would be something that you would just play softly for your own enjoyment. With the design of the mechanism, we know that the tone would be sustained until the player released a key, and you could actually do a little bit of vibrato on some clavichords where you would sustain the key and then you'd wiggle your finger. Let's see if I can do that here. There we go. And it would actually create a little bit of vibrato. So here's a link if you'd like to hear the sound of a clavichord. And again, it was an instrument that began to die out after the Renaissance period and into the Baroque. But it was, like I said, in this age where more and more amateurs were coming on the scene, more people wanted to be involved in music across the board. It was a great portable instrument that really was accessible to just about anybody. Also, as we finish up the Renaissance and move into the Baroque, increasingly the major keyboard instrument was the harpsichord. So I imagine most of you have seen a harpsichord or heard a harpsichord. We actually have two harpsichords here at VSU. Essentially, the thing that makes a harpsichord different from a piano is the mechanism. So when you look inside a piano, for example, and I'm sure you all have at some point, you see some felt hammers that come down and strike the metal strings, and that creates the sound. In a harpsichord, the sound is created by a plectrum, which is a mechanism that goes from the key that attaches to something that looks a little bit like a guitar pick, which plucks the strings. For that reason, you can't sustain notes on the harpsichord. It pretty much goes pluck and stops. The sound is quite a bit brighter, and increasingly it became used for accompaniment, especially of instrumental music, and then down the road for vocal music as well. So here's a link to a harpsichord sound. The next time we have one out on stage for one of our concerts or something like that, you're certainly welcome to go take a look. Harpsichords are pretty finicky in terms of being tuned. You have to tune them a whole lot because the strings always go out of adjustment. So I urge all of you, if say on your recital you're considering doing a Baroque piece or Renaissance piece, to encourage you to use the harpsichord, but just go into it with your eyes open, that you will have to arrange multiple tunings as things are going by. Well, another thing that was super important in the Renaissance in terms of instrumental music was dance music. So dancing in the Renaissance was considered an essential social skill. It wasn't just something you would do for fun. There were things that you could do for courtly ceremonies, for processions, for courtship. So knowing how to dance was an essential social skill for people of breeding in the Renaissance period. Dance music, we begin now to see the notated and instrumentalists playing from notated dance music, although improvisation was still pretty common. And again, we have quite a bit of dance music repertoire actually that has existed from this period. One of our great Renaissance dance collections is actually from a bigger collection called the Danserie. It was actually published in Belgium, in Antwerp, I think around 1551. And it really has some great examples of Renaissance dance. So this is my favorite one, La Morisque. I believe it's also in your score collection, but go ahead and take a listen and you can get an idea of what some of the dance music sounds like from the period. Well, one of the major centers for instrumental music in the Renaissance was Venice. So Venice, of course, is the beautiful city in Italy, built on and around a system of canals. And it became especially important to the development of instrumental music because at the time we're talking about, it was a kind of independent city-state run by several really important and rich families under one head duke. So the Duke was super patron of the arts, super rich, and so it was a great, great time for music and musicians if you lived in or around Venice, Italy. Venice was also important commercially. It was one of the chief ports in Europe, and it controlled territories in a lot of surrounding areas. We know that the government spent lavishly on music and on the arts. I hope at some point in the future some of you get to Venice. Again, it's there we has these little canals that go through the city, so you essentially take a boat from place to place rather than walk on sidewalks. And again, it's a great, beautiful example of one of these early cities that we're talking about. Well, the religious center of Venice was a church called St. Mark's. And there's a picture of St. Mark's. This was essentially the private chapel of the head duke. So most of the major civic and religious ceremonies that were going on in Venice took place here. The head choir master post became the most coveted job for vocalists or conductors in all of Italy. For a long time, a composer named Monteverdi held the post in the 1600s, and we'll talk about Monteverdi more when we get into the Baroque period. Another thing that the Duke instituted at St. Mark, which made it so important to instrumentalists, is that he hired a permanent instrumental ensemble, which began around 1568. The core group of this instrumental ensemble were brass, so cornets and sackbuts and zincs. But eventually that was expanded to include stringed instruments like forerunners of the violin, the bassoon, and on major feast days or celebrations like Christmas or Easter, they would hire like an additional 24 musicians. So it was one of the great employers and really stable places where an instrumentalist could make a living in the period. Along with that, the Duke hired several composers to be in his stable of musicians. Of those, the most well-known was Giovanni Gabrieli. So he was an organist, he was a great lute player, as you can see in this portrait, and today we remember him as a composer. He worked for St. Mark's for many years, a couple decades, until his death. He became famous for composing large pieces for multiple choirs and also published one of the first substantial collections of instrumental music. His other works include 100 motets, over 30 madrigals, and almost 80 instrumental works. So that was really unprecedented. Before this period, we didn't have a composer so invested in writing instrumental music. One thing he became famous for were things called polychoral motets. So a polychoral motet is a many-voiced motet. These were usually for 2 or more choirs of instruments. We know that St. Mark's had 2 very large organ lofts, and one on each side of the altar and another on the floor. So he got the idea to spread the groups out and have them perform antiphonally. So we actually have a lot of detailed choreography and instructions for how Gabrieli wanted these groups spaced out in St. Mark's. And today it's really neat, especially for our brass players, to do some of this music antiphonally. When next we're able to not socially distance, I would love to have our brass players come in and space around the choir room and perform like that. But for now, you can use your imaginations and what that would sound like if you were fortunate enough to be down in the center of it all. So here's a great example of some Gabrieli. This is from a collection of polychoral motets he did called the Sacré Symphonie. You can find it, let me check the page here, it's about 454. Again, you'll notice when you look at the score collection, there are lots of different parts. So this is like one of these polychoral pieces where you can actually use different combinations of instruments for this. Voice people might confiscate it, but it was usually performed instrumentally. In this case, I believe there's a combination of strings and sackbuts and early trumpets. They do some elaboration or improvisation among the existing melodic structure, and you can see there are whole tons of imitative entries. So this is a great example of the imitative counterpoint that we've been talking about since we started the Renaissance. So go ahead and take a listen and enjoy this, one of the first important instrumental works. And with this lecture, we wrap up the Renaissance period. So I'll see you again next time when we begin the Baroque. Take care, everybody.